Imagine a wealthy white man, skeptical and fearful of black people, stranded on a quiet road, only to have his entire perspective changed by the selfless kindness of a young black boy. Matthew Evans, a wealthy man in his late 70s, sat alone in his silver Mercedes, tapping his thumb impatiently against the steering wheel. The air conditioner hummed, barely keeping the oppressive Kentucky heat at bay. Retired and affluent after a lifetime of success in finance, Matthew was accustomed to the world bending to his will. Yet that day he found himself stranded with a flat tire, far removed from the comforts of his pristine mansion on the outskirts of town. After several failed attempts to reach roadside assistance, he sighed deeply, resigning himself to the reality that he might be stuck for some time. Just as frustration began to bubble to the surface, a figure emerged in the distance. A young boy, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, approached down the dusty road. Clad in a faded t-shirt and worn-out sneakers, the boy walked with determination, his gaze fixed on the stranded vehicle. Matthew observed as the boy's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing the situation before he gave a polite but confident nod. "Got a flat, sir?" the boy asked, his voice steady and clear. Yes, I do," Matthew replied, feeling a peculiar mix of relief and unease. "I was hoping for some help, but my phone's got no signal out here." The boy gave a small smile. "I can help with that," he said, kneeling beside the tire without hesitation. "My grandpa taught me how to change a tire last summer. Do you have a spare?" Matthew gestured toward the trunk, watching as the boy opened it and retrieved the necessary tools. The boy worked swiftly, his hands moving with a quiet confidence that belied his young age. Matthew stood nearby, an unfamiliar sense of humility creeping over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. As the boy focused intently on the task, Matthew considered offering him something in return. Yet the boy didn't pause or glance up. He was fully absorbed in his work. Within minutes, the boy straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans and stepping back. "All done," he said simply, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. Matthew reached into his wallet and pulled out a few bills, holding them out to the boy. "Here, take this. I really appreciate your help." But the boy took a step back, raising his hand in polite refusal. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need anything. Just happy to help." Stunned, Matthew stood there, the money still in his hand, as he watched the boy turn and walk away down the road. The brief interaction left him unexpectedly moved, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. Alone once more, Matthew slipped the money back into his wallet, climbed into his car, and watched the boy's figure shrink in his rearview mirror as he drove away. For the remainder of his drive, Matthew's thoughts kept returning to the boy. There was a quiet dignity about him, a self-assurance born not of wealth or privilege, but of something much deeper. That night, as he sat alone in his lavish home, Matthew couldn't shake the memory of the boy walking away with nothing but a smile. The image lingered as he settled into the leather armchair in his study, surrounded by shelves of books he rarely opened. The room was silent, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. His dinner, a perfectly cooked steak with asparagus, sat untouched on the side table. Matthew's mind wandered to the thousands of people he had encountered throughout his life. Business partners, employees, investors. Every interaction seemed to revolve around transactions, favors, or negotiations. There was always an exchange, a price, or an expectation. But this boy, this stranger, had helped him without any ulterior motive, driven solely by kindness. Leaning back, Matthew sipped his scotch, replaying the memory of the boy's confident smile in his mind. The boy hadn't appeared to have much. His worn shoes, faded clothes, and dusty demeanor were evidence enough. Yet there was an undeniable richness in his character, a generosity that transcended material possessions. Matthew found himself grappling with a realization he couldn't ignore. Perhaps his wealth had shielded him from truly understanding the value of simple, selfless acts. That evening, surrounded by the trappings of his success, he felt something shift within him. As he stared into the amber liquid in his glass, Matthew made a quiet resolution. He didn't know the boy's name or where he lived, but the encounter had left a lasting impression. Perhaps it was time to step out of his cocoon of privilege and reconnect with the humanity he had long overlooked. In the solitude of his grand home, Matthew began to see the world and his place in it through a different lens. That boy, with his humble demeanor and selfless act, had taught him more in a single moment than years of success ever could. His hands told a story, yet the boy carried himself with a kind of integrity that seemed so rare these days. The next morning, Matthew couldn't resist the urge to find the boy. He didn't know why, but something inside him felt unfinished. Maybe it was guilt, maybe gratitude, or maybe just curiosity. Whatever the reason, he found himself driving down the same stretch of road, scanning the horizon for any sign of the boy. Hours passed as he stopped at gas stations and small diners, asking anyone who would listen if they'd seen a young boy fitting the description. Most shrugged or shook their heads. Finally, an older woman behind the counter at a small cafe spoke up. "Sounds like you're talking about Elijah," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "That boy's always helping folks around here. Lives with his mama over in Harlan." "Harlan," Matthew repeated, making a mental note. "Thank you." The town of Harlan was an hour away, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachians. The drive was scenic, but Matthew barely noticed, his mind racing with questions. What kind of life did this boy have? What kind of family raised someone like that? When he arrived in Harlan, the streets were quiet, lined with modest homes and small businesses. After asking a few locals about Elijah, he was eventually pointed to a small house on the edge of town. The house was worn but tidy, with a front porch that sagged slightly under its own weight. Matthew parked his car and hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he would even say. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. It opened moments later, revealing a woman in her early 40s. She looked tired but kind, her eyes sharp and curious as she sized him up. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Good morning," Matthew said, clearing his throat. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe I met your son yesterday. Elijah, right? He helped me with a flat tire." Her expression softened instantly. "That sounds like my Elijah," she said with a small smile. "He's always helping folks." "I just wanted to thank him properly," Matthew said. "He wouldn't accept anything from me yesterday." She nodded and stepped aside to let him in. "He's out back. You're welcome to wait." Matthew stepped inside, taking in the modest surroundings. The furniture was old but clean, and the walls were adorned with family photos and a few hand-drawn pictures that looked like they came from a much younger Elijah. It was a far cry from his own home, with its pristine surfaces and expensive artwork, yet something about this space felt warmer, more alive. He followed her out to the backyard where Elijah was repairing the fence. The boy looked up, surprised to see Matthew. "Hey, mister," Elijah said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What are you doing here?" Matthew smiled, feeling strangely nervous. "I wanted to thank you again. You helped me when I really needed it, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it." Elijah shrugged, his expression easy and genuine. It wasn't a big deal, but to Matthew it was, and he was determined to show it. Elijah leaned against the fence, his curious gaze fixed on Matthew. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The boy's calm demeanor made Matthew feel slightly out of place, as though he were the one being judged. "I don't think you realize what a big deal it was," Matthew finally said, breaking the silence. "People don't usually help strangers without expecting something in return." Elijah tilted his head slightly, as if puzzled by the statement. "I don't see it like that," he replied. "If someone needs help and I can do it, why wouldn't I?" Matthew was struck by the simplicity of the boy's logic. He looked past Elijah to the yard. The fence was patched together with mismatched wood, the grass uneven and sparse. Behind the house, an old swing set leaned precariously, its chains rusted and broken. It was clear that Elijah's family didn't have much, but they made do with what they had. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," Matthew said, meaning it. "Your mother must be proud." Elijah grinned, glancing back toward the house. "She works hard. I just try to help out where I can." Matthew was quiet for a moment, absorbing the boy's words. He thought of his own life, his wealth, his success, and the countless opportunities he'd had to help others, many of which he'd ignored. He'd been so focused on building his fortune that he'd lost sight of what really mattered. You know, Matthew began, his voice soft, I think you've taught me something important. Elijah raised an eyebrow. What's that? That helping someone isn't about what you get in return, Matthew said, his tone thoughtful. It's about doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Elijah nodded, his expression serious. That's what my grandpa always said. Matthew smiled, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. As he left the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter had changed him in ways he hadn't yet fully understood. For the first time in a long time, he felt inspired, not by wealth or success, but by the quiet strength of a boy named Elijah. Matthew stood in the yard, his gaze drifting to the patched fence and the uneven grass, a flood of memories washing over him. He was reminded of his own childhood, spent in a house much like this one. His parents had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, teaching him the value of hard work and perseverance. Over the years, those lessons had faded as he became consumed with the pursuit of wealth and status. Now, standing here, he felt an odd mixture of nostalgia and regret. I'd like to do something for you and your family, Matthew said at last. Elijah straightened up, his expression cautious. We're okay, mister. We don't need anything. It's not about need, Matthew insisted. It's about what's right. You helped me, and I'd like to return the favor. Before Elijah could respond, his mother stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Elijah, you better come inside and wash up before lunch, she called. Her eyes shifted to Matthew. Would you care to join us? It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome. Matthew hesitated, unaccustomed to such an invitation. The sincerity in her voice, however, left him no room for excuses. I'd like that, he said, following her into the house. Inside, the kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread and roasted vegetables. The table, though small and surrounded by mismatched chairs, was set with care. Matthew took a seat, feeling strangely out of place in his tailored suit amidst such humble surroundings. Elijah washed his hands at the sink and joined them, his easy smile never wavering. As they ate, Matthew found himself drawn into their world. Elijah spoke with enthusiasm about his school, his friends, and his dreams of becoming an engineer. His mother shared stories about the community, her voice filled with quiet pride as she described how neighbors looked out for one another. Matthew listened intently, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. For all his wealth and success, his own home felt cold and empty compared to this modest house, filled with laughter and connection. After lunch, as they cleared the table, Matthew turned to Elijah's mother. You've done a remarkable job raising him, he said. He's got more heart than most people I know. She smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. Thank you. He's a good boy, but we've had our struggles. We've learned to appreciate the small things. Matthew nodded, his mind already turning over ideas. He didn't want to overstep, but he couldn't walk away without doing something for them. This family had given him a gift he hadn't realized he needed, a reminder of what truly mattered. That afternoon, Matthew drove back to his estate with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. The sprawling property, with its manicured lawns and imposing gates, suddenly seemed hollow. He began to plan not an act of charity, but a way to honor Elijah's selflessness and the resilience of his family. They deserved more than patched fences and worn furniture. They deserved stability and recognition. The next morning, Matthew made calls, lots of them. He reached out to old colleagues, contractors, and suppliers. By midday, a plan was set in motion. Within a week, trucks and workers began arriving at Elijah's home. Matthew stood on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, directing the renovations. Elijah and his mother watched in shock as supplies were unloaded and the work began. You didn't have to do this, Elijah's mother said, her voice trembling. We've managed fine on our own. Matthew turned to her, his expression earnest. You've done more than manage. You've thrived. But you gave me something I didn't know I was missing. Let me give back. Elijah stood quietly next to his mother, his thoughtful gaze fixed on the flurry of activity. Matthew knelt slightly, meeting his eye. You taught me something, Elijah. Helping people isn't about money, it's about showing up. I want to show up for you. Over the next several weeks, the house underwent a complete transformation. The sagging porch was replaced with sturdy wood, the roof repaired, and the rusty swing set out back was replaced with a new one. Inside, the walls were painted in warm colors, the floors polished to a shine, and the kitchen outfitted with modern appliances. Neighbors stopped by to admire the changes, their admiration mingled with gratitude. Elijah's mother, though overwhelmed at first, gradually accepted the improvements with a quiet dignity. One evening, as the final touches were being added, Elijah approached Matthew. You didn't have to do all this, he said, his voice soft but firm. Matthew smiled. Maybe not, but sometimes it's about more than fixing a tire or repairing a house. It's about paying forward the kindness we receive. Elijah nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Well, I'm going to do the same someday. I have no doubt, Matthew replied, his chest swelling with pride. As he drove home that night, Matthew felt something he hadn't in years: contentment. This time, it wasn't tied to a business deal or an acquisition, but to the simple act of giving back. Elijah and his family had reminded him of a truth he'd long forgotten, that the richest lives are those filled with kindness, connection, and purpose. The kitchen, now upgraded with modern appliances, had become the heart of the home. At first, Elijah tried to help with the renovations, carrying planks and sweeping debris, but Matthew insisted he take a break. Your job, Matthew said with a smile, is to enjoy being a kid for a little while. Still, Elijah couldn't resist sneaking out to watch the crew work, his eyes lighting up with curiosity as he observed them measure, cut, and build. One of the workers, a burly man named Joe, noticed his interest and invited him to help measure wood planks. Before long, Elijah was asking questions about tools and construction, his excitement infectious. Matthew watched from a distance, a warm pride swelling in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt he was doing something meaningful, something beyond himself. The boy's energy reminded him of the ambition he once had, before life became a blur of boardrooms and stock portfolios. As the sun dipped low one evening, the project was nearing its end. The family stood on the porch, marveling at the transformation. Elijah's mother turned to Matthew, her voice choked with emotion. This isn't just a house anymore, it's a home. I don't know how we can ever thank you. Matthew shook his head, his tone soft. You already have. You reminded me of what life is supposed to be about: family, connection, and purpose. I think I'm the one who should be thanking you. The final day of the renovation project felt like a celebration. Neighbors stopped by to see the changes, offering smiles and small gifts: freshly baked bread, jars of homemade jam, and even a potted plant. Elijah's laughter echoed through the yard as he raced around, showing his friends the new swing set and the freshly painted rooms. Inside, the house, once tired and worn, now radiated life. Matthew stood on the front porch, leaning against the sturdy new railing, watching the scene unfold. He hadn't felt this kind of joy in years, simple, unfiltered joy that came from seeing others thrive. Elijah's mother walked over, a cup of iced tea in her hand. She offered it to him with a smile. You've done more than fix a house, she said softly. You've given us hope, and I think you found something for yourself, too. Matthew nodded, taking a sip. I have, he admitted. I spent so many years chasing things I thought mattered. Money, status, influence. But none of it feels like this. None of it ever filled me the way this has. As the sun began to set, Elijah joined them on the porch, his energy still boundless. He looked at Matthew, his expression thoughtful. Mr. Matthew, he began, I've been thinking a lot about what you did for us. I want to do something like that one day. I want to help people too. Matthew placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, his voice steady. You already are, Elijah. Your kindness set all of this in motion. Don't ever lose that. The three of them sat together, watching the sky shift from gold to deep orange. The warmth of the day lingered, but there was a deeper warmth, one that came from connection, gratitude, and a shared sense of purpose. When it was time for Matthew to leave, Elijah and his mother walked him to his car. The boy's wide grin and his mother's tearful smile were etched into Matthew's memory as he drove away. This wasn't the end, he realized. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in all their lives. The weeks that followed brought even more changes. Elijah's newfound curiosity about construction blossomed into a passion. Matthew arranged for him to spend time shadowing the workers who had helped renovate the house, and Elijah soaked up every bit of knowledge, eager to learn. Matthew, in turn, found himself drawn back to Harlan again and again. Each visit felt less like a trip and more like a return home. He no longer felt like an outsider in their lives. He was part of something bigger now. And for the first time in years, he was content. The story ended where it had begun, in a small town with a big heart. One act of kindness from a young boy had reminded an old man of life's greatest lesson. It's not about what you have, but what you give. This story is a powerful reminder of the impact even small acts of kindness can have. Elijah's selflessness set off a chain of events that changed not just his family's life, but Matthew's as well. Imagine what the world could be like if we all embraced the same spirit of generosity and connection. If this story inspired you, remember, you too can make a difference. Big or small, your actions matter. Together, we can create a kinder, more connected world. Follow our channel for more heartwarming stories like this, and let's inspire each other to spread goodness wherever we go. Star